A day after his private burial, where he was laid to rest in his favourite church, the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. The tomb of Pope Francis will open to visitors in Rome on Sunday. Officials said hundreds of thousands lined the streets to mourn the Pope as his coffin travelled from the Vatican following his funeral on Saturday. Huge crowds had gathered in St. Peter's Square for the main service, which was attended by dozens of heads of state and royal guests. The Vatican has released new pictures of Pope Francis's tomb, where he was buried yesterday. Our religion editor Ali Makboul reports.
St. Peter's, named after the apostle considered by Catholics to be the first pope, the basilica's curved colonnades representing the open arms of an embrace. This was the spectacular backdrop for the farewell to the 266th Pope. Inside the basilica, ahead of the funeral mass, a last chance for visiting dignitaries, including the Prince of Wales, to pay their respects. Sir Keir Starmer, one of dozens of world leaders in attendance. There was applause in the crowd when President Zelensky appeared. But by mid-morning, the invited guests took their seats. Clergy on the right looking out, politicians and sovereigns on the left. But other guests invited at Pope Francis' request included prison inmates, migrants and torture victims. On the streets around St. Peter's Square, 250,000 others waited. And then, to start proceedings, the body of Pope Francis was brought through the basilica. In the coffin with him, his mitre or papal hat, his pastoral staff or crozier, and a scroll, a written record of his life and pontificate. There was gentle, spontaneous applause through the huge crowds as the coffin emerged into the light. Its 14 pallbearers taking it to the front of this breathtaking arena. Presenting it to the world, but not on a platform, Pope Francis had asked that his coffin be placed on the ground.
Dominus pascit me, et nihil mihi derit.
Although elements of the funeral have been simplified following instructions left by Pope Francis himself, the magnitude of the moment is still reflected in the ritual and tradition and spectacle on this stunning stage. It was 91-year-old Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re who presided over the Mass and delivered the homily, reflecting on the things Pope Francis cared about, his opposition to war, his passion for the environment and for the dignity of migrants. He mentioned some notable papal trips. It is significant that Pope Francis' first journey was to Lampedusa, he says, an island that symbolises the tragedy of migration, with thousands of people drowning at sea, as well as the celebration of a Mass on the border between Mexico and the United States. At talk of these causes, the crowd applauded, though there may have been discomfort for some politicians. At the end of the Mass, there was a final blessing for Pope Francis. But he wasn't going to be buried at St. Peter's like other popes, but would instead be taken in a converted popemobile to his favourite spot at a different basilica in the centre of Rome. More than 150,000 people lined the streets to say goodbye, a nod to the connection he had to the masses. At the Pope's destination, a group of people from homeless centres waited to welcome him.
Et omnes qui vivit et credit in me.
So too did the clergy who'd participate in the final part of today's ceremonies. Away from the gaze of the public, the late Pope was laid to rest in a tomb inscribed with just one word, the Latin version of his chosen name, Franciscus.
That report by religion editor Alim Makbul. Well, Andrea Tonielli is the media editor for the Holy See. He told me what it was like to be at the Pope's funeral.
I think that the funeral was a simple and a beautiful ceremony. The people of God, the simple faithful, took center stage. 1,000 people participated in the square and the street of Rome. Only 1 week ago, we have to remember, the Pope met for the last time the people in St. Peter's Square. And yesterday, people have returned this embrace. Yesterday was touched by the presence of representatives of other religions' faith. And then I was struck by the meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky, because Francis' cry for peace was what characterized his pontificate to the very end. The meeting between the two presidents was, I think, the last little miracle of Pope Francis.
Indeed, it was a symbolic meeting. How would you describe the mood among officials at the Vatican about what comes next in terms of electing a new pope?
I think that we have to wait, and we have to wait the meeting between cardinals. So it's impossible to speak about this now. But I want to underline the legacy of Pope Francis. I believe the most important legacy he leaves is the magisterium of mercy. In these years, during all his pontificate, he has shown the face of a church with open doors, which welcomes everyone. He spoke about a church that is a field hospital and not a customs house. He has shown tenderness and closeness toward all, but especially toward the humble, the last, the poor, the sinners. People have understood this attitude and this teaching of the Pope of Mercy very well. During the last World Youth Day, he repeated that the church is a welcoming home for everyone. I think that this legacy, it's important also for the church now.
Yes, everyone is talking about his legacy in terms of spreading the message of mercy, and he was incredibly popular as well. Do you think that that's the natural direction for the church going forward now?
It's impossible to say now, because the cardinal, they have to discuss. And in this period, they have to discuss the future of the church. But this process, it will start next Monday with the congregation of cardinals. So they have to arrive, all the electors in Rome, and they have to discuss.
Andrea Tonielli there. Well, let's show you some pictures that have just come in from the Vatican. These are images showing the tomb of Pope Francis. So this is in the Basilica of the Santa Maria Maggiore church, and this is where he was laid to rest on Saturday evening, of course, after that solemn, powerful funeral service that saw hundreds of thousands of people in attendance. Crucially today, members of the public will be able to visit the Basilica there and to pay their respects at the tomb of Pope Francis. Of course, engraved on the tomb is simply the name Francis in Latin. Of course, that was his papal name. Now, a day after his private burial, where he was laid to rest in his favourite church, the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, the tomb of Pope Francis will open to visitors in Rome on Sunday. Officials said hundreds of thousands lined the streets to mourn the Pope as his coffin travelled from the Vatican following his funeral on Saturday. Huge crowds